Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Kyler Canastra.
And I'm Shaheen Samavati. We're your hosts of the Content Mix podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about creating content at scale.
So, what do we mean by content at scale? Basically, creating a lot of content at once. And at Vera Content, we work with clients who produce hundreds of pieces of content every month and are constantly publishing across a wide variety of platforms.
So why are they creating so much content, you might ask? Well, on a single channel, publishing more than a few times a week would probably be overkill, but our clients are often publishing on several channels, and these channels can often be market specific, but there can also be multiple channels per market because they represent different brands or content initiatives they have going on.
And we have a lot of experience working on some very complex content operations. So today, Shaheen and I are going to be sharing some of our top tips for those of you looking to scale up your content creation.
With so many moving parts, the key to creating a lot of content and doing it well is having airtight processes. We recently talked about the importance of having a strong editing process, which is one of the key processes, but there's a lot more to it than that.
So we're going
to be going more into detail.
We're going more into detail. And I guess to get the ball rolling, I'm going to ask you, what are those main processes that need to be established to manage content creation at scale?
I think of it as kind of being in four parts. First of all, talent selection. So finding the right people for your projects and having always having the right people on hand, and then managing their availabilities for them to take on the assignments. Mm-hmm. So I'm talking about the writers and the content creators who are actually doing the work. Mm-hmm. And then there's the part of managing the content calendar. So that involves content planning, creation, editing, and publishing. Mm-hmm. And then there's everything to do with like feedback, quality control, and implementing best practices. So yeah, there's several parts of the process, and everything has to come together to be able to like consistently put out excellent quality and large amounts of content.
For sure. So all these processes play an important role, and they come together, kind of like the engine of the car, getting all the pieces together to make it all work and go smoothly.
Exactly. I think that like when people think about content creation, a lot of times they think about like the challenge being finding the right people, but I think that that's not the biggest challenge. It's like there's a lot of writers out there, but it's like I think it's having like super clear processes in place, having every instructions super clear for those writers, having the criteria for what kind of writers you need for what kind of projects, and having that all like really defined is essential for being able to create content on a consistent basis.
Exactly. And making it clear too, and like having clear expectations from the beginning, making sure that every person involved in the process knows their role and what they have to do in order to produce the content needed.
Exactly. Yeah. So, well, on the talent selection side of it, I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit, Kyler, on how we do talent selection and how we choose writers.
Yeah, I definitely think this part of the whole process can be quite overwhelming for people because it's so much. You have so much variety in terms of picking talent, especially nowadays online. For example, I think a lot of people can be stressed because it can be overwhelming. You have so many different, work samples and different profiles to look through. So how do you start? And I think it's really important to test the writers first and their competencies to make sure they're the right fit for the project. So you can, depending on how much time you have, there's so many different factors that could be involved in this process, and it could impact how you go about this. But I do think it's important to have some sort of application process when looking for a right talent for a project. So you could be a bit more relaxed and ask them to send you work samples, for example, of writing samples from previous, if they have previous work published, or if they've done work for different clients, stuff like that, looking at their experience and their resume. I think that's like a basic something that I would do across the board before even hiring anyone for any project, because I think that's like the essentials to make sure that they are competent in the area that you need and also have good writing and good style and experience in the field. And then a lot of times I think like a very common practice and probably an easy practice is that if you are already working on the project, you could give this new writer, in this case, a test assignment. So basically it's like taking an assignment that you already have, which is a real assignment that you're going to produce as a team, and having them work on part of it, and then evaluating that with an experienced editor. So usually you'd have people already working on the project who are editing, right? That's the whole, we love quality at Vera Content. So for us, it's important to always have an editor, and that editor is someone that you trust. They can evaluate the writing. So it's kind of like taking a real world situation and using it as a test. And that's really helpful too, to see how they work and how they perform right in this situation. And also you can see how much time they dedicated to it. And kind of all their style choices, you can take those things into consideration while you evaluate them to see if they're a good fit. And then if you don't have assignments available, though, like say it's a new project and you're trying to onboard 10 people at once, a good way of doing that would be making a fake assignment. So kind of having, taking a real world context, a real world situation, and then making it up so that you can kind of send it out as like a test for the different writers to do, and that way you can evaluate. So it depends. You have different options when it comes to testing writers for competencies, but I think those are like the main. I think the minimum definitely is work samples. And evaluating their experience. But then you can also do like test assignments in different ways that will help you see how they actually perform with the assignment itself.
Yeah. I mean, we always ask for a combination of work samples, and we do a test assignment before we start before we approve someone to work on projects regularly with us. And I think like the limitation with work samples is that oftentimes, especially if they've been published on a major platform, it's usually been edited by someone else. So it's not always the best example of their own work. So it's necessary to like assign them something to see how they really work. And also you're seeing not only the quality of their writing, but also how they interact with you, how professional they are, how fast they get back to you, and all of that, which is super important for your working relationship.
Yeah. It's like you kind of get a sense of the person and who they are. So for your communications with them, how they perform in the assignment. But I also think like these assignments, like using a test assignment, is really important as well, because it gives people the opportunity to grow as well. So say you might sign a writer that they might make some mistakes or things that you don't like, or style choices that you don't agree with, but you might see like, oh, they have room to grow with this project. So it's kind of like you're giving people a better opportunity to showcase what they can do. It may not be 100% perfect, but you see potential with that person and you give them feedback, and you know that after maybe 2 more assignments, they'll be nailing it every time. So I think it's a fairer way of evaluating people too, because you're giving them an opportunity to actually perform rather than just sending you work samples.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think like a common question that comes up when you're giving out fake assignments, because like you said, sometimes you just don't have a real assignment at the moment, and you need to onboard people for a project that maybe hasn't started yet, or you don't have the specifications for yet. So when sending out like a test assignment, a fake one, there's this debate about like whether you should pay the person for that, because it's not something that's going to be used and you're not going to make any money off of it, basically. Right. And our policy has been to at least offer like a token amount for those assignments, because obviously it is time you're asking the person to take. And freelancers, I mean, if you want the freelancer to prioritize your test assignment, you need to usually offer them something. Of course, there's also the promise of getting a lot more work from you if they're successful. Exactly. Assignment.
Yeah, I think it's important with that to be clear from the beginning. So you can be like, this might be the rate we're offering you for this test assignment, but like if everything goes well, like you'd be making this much for every assignment. And we can offer you more work, and then making sure you stand by that as well. But like you said, I think it's you're asking people to take time for you. So I think, unfortunately, time is money, and I think that's just how it is. And I think it's just a fair gesture to do by giving them a little bit of money to do an assess assignment as well.
Absolutely. And then, we're working with multilingual projects. So how does this process differ if you're dealing with someone who's, working in a language that you don't speak yourself? What are the challenges there?
Now that's a great question. I get that. We get asked that all the time. And I think when I was project managing and when I started doing more multilingual projects, like this was something that's kind of stressed me out at the beginning, because I hadn't had an experience like working with German, for example, and I don't speak any German. So it was like stressful for me to, be managing a project that I'm not 100% sure about, like how the language skills are, what we're producing is up to par, et cetera. So this does come up a lot. And it definitely is a very valid concern. But I think what we've realized at Vera Content is that like it's like chicken and egg situation. So it's like having trusted editors on your team already is so essential to this, that work in those languages. So like having people that you trust, that can evaluate and provide you the feedback in your language. So in this case, for me, most likely be in English. And I think like that's so essential. So, but it's hard though, because and I think Shaheen, you have experience with this too, like building the company, like how do you have good editors when you don't speak that language? But I think a lot of it is, I think it's something really important to keep in mind, is that like language is a barrier here. But there's things that like a good writer does that it doesn't matter what language you're writing in. So I think like evaluating those competencies as well is important. So yes, obviously having an editor there to tell you like, hey, this is good, this is not good, it's important. But I think like you can see, for example, how thorough someone is with an assignment. How much time have they spent on it? Have they taken into consideration the tone and style considerations that you shared with them beforehand? I think like just like, have they gone through it? And you can even look at like, if we're working on a Google Doc, for example, you can see track changes, which I mean, not all writers will prefer to work in a Google Doc. They usually just copy and paste it after, but still you can look at things like that to see like how much time they spent. And if they take in your consideration, like all your specifications that you put in the brief, and they have kept them in mind while doing the project. But I also think like their feedback, if they have feedback for you about the project, or your editor has feedback for them, how receptive they are to that feedback, I think it's really important to keep, like, I think that shows you kind of what kind of person the professional this person is. And I think it's important that if you're running a big content production, you have to have a feedback system. We'll talk about that more later. But I think it's having people who are very open to feedback and willing to implement that is like important, and that's universal.
Right.
And I also think like if you ask them questions, so like you could have an editor ask you, maybe your trusted editor in that one language could ask them some questions about choices they made and their responses, and the responses itself, if they're thorough and very like explain themselves very well and show that they have a lot of decision making that's going behind in their process, I think that's another really big important factor to show if someone's a good writer or not, regardless of if you speak the language.
Right. Yeah. So you might not be able to really judge exactly their output that they're creating, but it's easy. There are easy ways to tell if the person is a professional, and like if they're following processes well, if their communication is good, if they're able to explain the decisions they made in their writing. And like you were saying, yeah, it is a chicken and egg situation. Like you need to have an established editing team before you can fully 100% be confident in consistently putting out great content in a language. And that's what we do at Vera. We're very good at certain languages that we've built up teams for, and we're not so good at other languages. And we're honest about that. I mean, we don't do Thai, for example, or there's a lot of languages we don't do because we don't have an editing team built for that. And it's something that, like, it's building that editing team in the beginning is difficult, because if you don't have anyone yet, you have to take a chance on the first people.
Right.
But then once you've built that up and you have people that have consistently put out great work, you can feel confident. So, but that is part of what's like the complexity of working on a multilingual project, and that's why people hire us, because it is an entire operation to have all the team put in place for every language.
Yeah, so, for sure. But I don't think it should let you like hold you back, I guess. I think a lot of people will be like, I don't want to do it because I don't speak the language, and it's not just that. I think it's much more that goes into the process.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if it is only a couple, like if you have an in-house team and you want to expand just into one or two more languages, it's totally possible to build your own internal team as well. Just following some best practices, the same way you would build a team for the first language, evaluating people based on their professionalism, based on their work samples, and based on the amount of feedback that they're able to give you about how they work. That can feel confident enough to trust them to be a writer and editor on your project.
Now we're talking a lot about trust, and I think that's very important in this process as well. making sure you can trust the people that you're working with. And especially nowadays, I think a lot of writers are working remote, so you're never going to meet these people in real life. So I think trust is like a key to having successful content production. With that being said, I think a lot of trust is built by people making, like, by having your team being available and knowing that you can rely on them in certain hours or certain times, or they're really good with deadlines. So I guess in your experience, Shaheen, like, how do you manage availability in the content, or how should what's the best practices that we have to manage availability of the team?
Yeah. So, well, I mean, yeah, that's definitely like a challenge of, especially for a business like ours, where we have a lot of variability in the volume of projects that we have, because we're working with a lot of different clients, high volume, different. Some weeks we have a lot more work than others, and I think it's probably not as much of a challenge if you have a very consistent content calendar where you're doing the same thing every week, so you can, have the same writers always available working on the same projects. But if you do have variability and new projects coming in from new clients, for example, then it's really important to, I mean, obviously we have our certain writers assigned to certain projects that are available for those. But when we do need more people, sometimes a lot of people at the same time for a new project, that means we need to really keep up to date what we call our talent database. And that is, it's basically a database of profiles of people that we've pre-selected because they had good work samples. Some of them have already done a test assignments. We have like different levels of approval within our talent database. And then we have, one of the fields that they have to include is their general availability, and they have to and we prompt them to update that on a regular basis, so that we always have an idea of who might be available for which project. But it is a game of matching the right people to the right project at the right time. And then we also have what we call retainer freelancers, which are people who work with us on a regular basis, and as well as like in-house editors. So these people are available all the time,
Right.
much, or have a large availability for us to be able to jump in on diverse projects.
Right. And they usually have a lot more experience with a lot of different projects and stuff like that. So it's helpful to when they're available, if they have wide availability, they can jump in on certain things and help. So it's good to have like a combination of the two to ensure that you always have people there for you when you need them.
Absolutely. So another super important element of the entire content creation process is making great briefs. So Kyler, maybe you could share what you think makes a great brief.
Yes, because a great brief is very, very important. And if you have a bad brief, you're already starting off the project on the wrong foot. I think a brief is like it's essential in any process, because it's like how you're setting expectations for what you want out of the writing in this case. So I think, well, obviously, one thing that's really important, I think, even before you're going into the content itself, is having a brief that's well organized and very easy to follow. So by that, I mean using bullet points when you think it's appropriate. Like, I wouldn't, like, sometimes I've received briefs when I was writing in the past that were like novels. Like, you had to read paragraph and paragraphs. And it's like a lot of times, and my situation was like, well, I have other assignments to be doing. Like, I don't have, I just want the most essential information and the easiest way to digest, basically, so that way I can get started with the project. So for me, when I was making briefs, it was very important to have a clear format, use bullet points, use links, make sure it's just visually pleasing, because if someone opens a brief and it's like a long novel, like I said before, they're not going to be motivated. It really it like turns you off in a way. So I think having a very well organized brief is essential before you.
That's why they call it a brief.
Yeah, exactly.
It should be short.
It should be short, which people forget that.
Reason, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Including myself sometimes. So I'm a victim of that. But yeah, and I think another important factor for a good brief is that like it really defines what specifications are important for the project, and always including those. So whether it could be like style specifications, it could be content expectations, it could be certain words that you should use, you shouldn't use. Now, a lot of times what we do in tandem with all of our projects at Vera Content is have a style guide that we are always working on and always adding more information as we get to know a client. So I would, in this case, link that style guide to this, for example, so they have that handy. But I think it's really important, like the main specification. So it could be obviously like word count, language, um, format, how it should be presented. Sometimes you might have a brief that was going to require you to like write in certain sections or using headlines, stuff like that. So it's important to keep those specifications in mind as well. And also like SEO is important. So if you have SEO keywords, including that like as a list in the brief is important. So anything that you want included should be made like very, very clear, and also like probably in the beginning of the brief. Another thing that's helpful is supporting resources. So making sure that you have any, if it requires research for the writer to do, kind of pointing them in the right direction. So you might have certain sources that you trust, certain articles that you've read and think are important and relevant for the piece of content you're working on, anything that can help them. And that also includes previous examples. So if you've been working on this project for a while, or you've done different, or you have different things already produced or published online that could serve as a reference for the writer, that's super important, I think. Or if you have any, even maybe a blog article you read that inspired you for this project, I think it's important to include what you're looking for, like examples of what you're looking for, because that really sets the tone. And I don't mean that in a like funny way, but does set the tone for like what you are looking for, and they can a good writer is able to channel that and understand that and reproduce it. And then I also think making sure you include the right level of detail, because a lot of times you might have all these ideas in your head and you just assume that someone can read your mind or like just understand everything that you're thinking about, but that's not true. So it's really important that like you can be as specific as possible, which kind of goes back to my first point, which is like you can include all the details that you want, but make sure that it's not like overwhelmingly there. So that's why like using lists and bullet points is super helpful. So you can kind of transmit a lot of information, but you don't have to like bog the writer down with like a very heavy and disorganized brief. So you can include a lot of information, but you can be concise and present it in a beautiful, well, visually pleasing way. So I think there's a lot of aspects to make a brief, but I think those are the key factors that you need to keep in mind.
Absolutely agree. The brief is like so important in the process. It's like the key point where you're transmitting what needs to be done to the writer, and it's your chance to be really specific and clear. And the more clear you can be in your instructions, the better the results are going to be with less back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think another part of being organized is clearly something that's like coming up a lot, and being organized in your brief is important, but also being organized in how you set up the project in terms of how you plan the content is also very important, especially when you have a lot of different people on like working on the same project. It's really important to have like a content calendar in this case that's very well like detailed and visually pleasing, and everyone can work on it. So I wanted to ask you, Shaheen, like what's the best way that you can set up a content calendar, and like what tools have you used in the past, or any tips you have for that?
Yeah, I think the basic concept of setting up a content calendar is pretty simple. It's just you need to have different stages, and you need to know the status of each assignment at each of the stages, and you need to be able to see who it's assigned to, and where they are on, like where they are in terms of status on the project. So like there's a lot of different tools you could use to do this. The most basic is to use a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets still work fine. Of course, it depends. Like the more we're talking about creating content at scale. So I mean, if it's a huge project, there's definitely benefits to using more sophisticated software. There's like dedicated tools you could use that are specifically for content calendars that look very beautiful. You can also use project management software, which often is very similar in terms of having like the possibility to visualize and carry over cards and things like that. So, I mean, it's kind of up to you to decide which tool works best for your team. Maybe you already have project management tools that you use in your company. But yeah, the important thing is that everyone knows how to use the tools. Everyone knows what information needs to be input on each assignment, and that everyone is updating the calendar, and that whoever's managing the project has an overview of everything that's going on and can see where each piece of content is in the process. And then, of course, it's that person's responsibility to plan certain amounts of time. Like we often work on a monthly basis. So it's setting up a calendar in advance. In our case, we need approval from the client on the calendar. If it's your own calendar, you might need internal approval. So setting up an approval process is also often part of this process. So that's kind of like the high level of how to set up a content calendar. And of course, it really depends on the channels that you're using, whether you want to put things on one calendar, have separate calendars for each channel. And I mean, a best practice is to have a different calendar if it's like, for example, if you want to have for your social media, have certain content, maybe for your blog, you might create another calendar, for example. But like you said, the key is keeping everything organized so everyone knows what's going on at all times.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful tool in terms of giving your team independence, I think, as well, because I think it might sound like very micromanagey that we're having like this whole calendar and planning every stage and updating, but I think it gives your team a lot of independence because they're able to update those stages and the assignment statuses themselves, and they know that like you don't have to be on top of them essentially. So not only does it give them more independence and autonomy in the project, but also allows you to do more things with your time. So you don't have to, always be checking in on writers. It's going to be done. You just have a very clear system established that they can update their own statuses there. So absolutely. I think it's really helpful.
So speaking of that, maybe you could talk a little bit about how to make communication easier with your content team.
Yeah. So this is a very open-ended question because there's so many different ways to communicate with your team. But I think probably the thing you should always keep in mind is that you need to make yourself available somehow. So I think from the beginning of the project, making it clear on how the person can communicate with you. So whether you're using email, for example, or Slack as another like communication tool, it doesn't matter which one you use, but I think it's just important so that your team knows when you're available and how they can get in touch with you. So that's key. And I also think depending on the tool depends on like what kind of project it is as well. So if it's, say it's like blog post writing and you're doing a monthly blog, I don't know if you need instant communication with everyone on the project because it's not like a lot of the things are going to be urgent and you have time to plan. You can kind of communicate in a more relaxed manner. And I think you could use email that's a very easy tool to use. And it's also a good way to keep track of everything. And it's pretty standard. But if you're working on a project that, if you're doing content production for, a brand that has like a lot of a quick turnover in terms of news or announcements and press, all these different things, you might need to have a more quicker solution. So like using Slack or any other instant messaging tool could be helpful for that because you might need to make decisions in a more timely manner rather than like on the blog management example. You don't have to, it's not like urgent that you make a decision about the blog before it gets published. You have more flexibility in terms of urgency and deadlines. So I think it's just important, like I said, to set the to set the expectation in the beginning, being like, hey team, I'm going to be available this many days a week at this certain amount of time, or I check my email once an hour. So I hopefully get back to you within this time. Just making that clear is super important because then it also shows that you're willing and available to help.
Absolutely. We actually have a resource available on our website that's about hiring, onboarding, and nurturing relationships with freelancers. So we can put a link to that in the blog post that's associated with this podcast.
For sure. So. It's definitely a helpful tool.
Yeah. That goes into a bit more detail about, establishing great relationships with freelancers and how to make assignments and all those kinds of things.
It is important, I think, especially the relationship aspect. Like, I think it gets overseen a lot, but I think by being clear and, writing good briefs and building that trust and making sure you're available really goes a long way. When it comes to managing freelancers, and because you want them to be invested in the project just as much as you are. So I think by showing your dedication, your commitment to it, which can be expressed through organization and commitment and availability, that goes a long way to having successful relationships with the writers, but also having a successful project.
Yeah. And we were talking before about like at Vera, we kind of have, I mean, we have our in-house project management team, in-house editors, but then we work with a ton of freelance writers, a very large number of them. And they're such an important part of our team because they're the ones producing the content. And I think making them really feel part of the team, keeping them in the loop of like what's going on in the company, giving them training opportunities and like, yeah, just making them feel kind of to buy into like what we're doing at the company is so important because it makes them really care about their work and put in 100% like they would if they were a full-time employee.
Exactly. And the care does like, it's very transparent in the quality of the writing as well. And I think as a final question to help us wrap up this, it's a very interesting and important topic. I wanted to ask Shaheen about her favorite topic, which I think is a good editing process. So in your opinion, do you think how important is it to have a good editing process, and how do we provide ongoing feedback and implement best practices along the way?
Yeah, we were kind of talking about this part of the process being like how you kind of close the loop and make sure that you're constantly improving. So editing, of course, is part of, when you're doing the content calendar and the content production, it's really important to have editing stages, of course. You need checks and balances to make sure that the work you're putting out is consistently good. We actually did an entire episode on that topic. So definitely check out our previous episode. But in terms of like, and we talk a lot about in that episode as well, like how important feedback is and how we've built in feedback processes at different stages. And yeah, it's like when we ask an editor to review a project, we don't only ask them to edit and submit it, which is I think what a lot of agencies do. But we also ask them to give qualitative feedback, like explain to the writer the decisions that they made, so that the writer can learn from it and implement that in the future. So I think that's so important, and that we have like put a regular, like we require this on every single assignment. So the writers are constantly getting qualitative feedback, and we also keep track of that in a monthly report so they can see every month, like this is all the feedback you've got this month, as a reminder to see trends and like how they can improve. And then, of course, on the bigger picture, from a project management perspective, we're constantly at every level of the company asking for feedback from the team. So, like the head of project management is having constantly having conversations with writers to ask them like what we could be doing better, and taking notes on those, bringing those to meetings with the project managers so we're able to implement that. And I think like having that feedback loop is so important to identify where issues are and to be able to keep improving.
Exactly. And it kind of ties into our core value, not to plug that in, but clear, honest communication. I think a lot of it is just, we're very honest in the work that we do with the feedback we have. And we allow everyone on the team, I think, to have a space to be honest as well, so they can share how they really feel. And that really helps us improve a lot of the processes that we have in place. But yeah, definitely check out that episode that we did, because I think we really dive into that process and how and showcase kind of why it's so important, but also how it's kind of been the driving force behind Vera content, I think.
Yeah, I talk a lot about my background as a journalist and like how important editing is in traditional journalism, and how we've kind of applied those values in our editing processes and exactly how we do things. So
definitely check it out. Now, yeah, and also definitely check out the resource we're talking about that we've created for managing freelancers. I think that's helpful. And we have a lot more helpful tools and resources and interesting blog articles related to this topic on our website. So I want to thank Shaheen again for all her wonderful insight. And I want to thank everyone for listening in. I think these past couple episodes have been really enjoyable for Shaheen and myself, because we're talking about things that we work on a daily basis. We've done a lot of work together on these things. So it's really great to kind of flesh them out together and also share our insights. But as always, for more perspectives on global content marketing and also other topics related to editing and managing freelancers, definitely check out veracontent.com/ podcast.com/mix. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, or if you have any interesting topic for an upcoming episode, we're always very open to new ideas and new topics. We feel free to reach out to us at mix@veracontent.com, and keep tuning to the podcast for more perspectives on topics related to the world of global content creation, also multilingual content creation. So we'll see you all next time.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. See you next time. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.